Hello, and welcome to Talk of the Town. I'm your host, Kathy Healy, along with my co-host, Emmy Macri. On today's show, we're going to be talking all about the historic Hartshorne House, located at 41 Church Street in Wakefield. With us today in the studio is one of the caretakers, Alan Drinkwater, along with the chair of the Wakefield Historical Commission, president of the Wakefield Historical Society, and member of the Hartshorne House Board of Directors, Nancy Bertrand. Welcome to the show, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having.
Yeah, so we're going to start by talking about a little history of the house and its owners. Nancy, if you can fill us in on that.
Sure. Well, the history of the house in many ways kind of follows the history of the town. That's the cool thing about historic house museums or historic homes as opposed to regular museums, because they kind of change with the times. And the very first residents that we know of were Tom and Mary Hodgman. There's kind of, there are disagreements with the actual age of the house. Because when the Hodgmans purchased the land, it was like in the 1660s. But we're not quite sure if the fragment of the house that they lived in dates to that time or not. We're pretty certain that it dates to at least 1681, so that's the number that we've used. And that was one portion of the house, we've now called it the 1681 room.
Right.
Just a small part of the house, but for the time, it was a fine, sturdy house. They built a second floor on it and a summer kitchen behind. And they lived there with their adopted son, Josiah Weber, all the way until 1725, and Mary Hodgman was still alive. And another cool thing is the deed was in her name because she had purchased it with money that she had inherited from her first husband.
That was very unique for that time period.
But women could have property, and she did. And so we get to see the deed with her signature on it. Of course, it was just an X, but it's kind of a neat thing. I mean, we're thinking about Women's History Month right now, so I always think of Mary Hodgman as, being a landowner as well as a wife and a mother, and she lived well into her 90s. She went on to live for another 10 years after they sold the house. Then a widow Patterson bought the house and lived there until 1757. And then Jonathan Cowdery bought the house. We don't know too much about widow Patterson, but Jonathan Cowdery was a clock and buckle maker. And he definitely added to the house. So now we've got kind of 2/3 of the house that you see now. And he lived there. He owned the land through the time of the American Revolution and historic times like that. And he fabricated clocks, buckles, weather vanes, things like that. And then the house was sold again to Dr. John Hart in 1790. Dr. John Hart was a Revolutionary War surgeon. He joined the Army, the Revolutionary War Army, at the Battle of Bunker Hill and stayed in all the way through to peacetime, which was very unusual for the time. So Dr. John Hart was then went on to actually own quite a lot of land, and this was one of his holdings, and he enlarged the house again. And while he owned the house, he used it kind of as an inn and also as a meeting place for the Mount Moriah Lodge of Masons.
And I have a question. Did he have a lot of different wives to his?
No, he
I'm thinking
didn't.
of another Dr. Hart.
Our Dr. Hart, we only know of one. We only know of one wife. He had several, and the Historical Society actually has portraits of a couple of his daughters.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he had 2 different daughters. They both married the same guy. One died, and then the other one married the
widower?
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
a little weird. But Dr. John Hart was a real character, and I always think of him as a hero. He went on to have a big part in local government. He was he was a state representative even.
Wow.
Now,
And
did he purchase the house before the Revolutionary War, or
no, after he came
Okay.
back, when he was originally from Ipswich, so he wanted to move with his family to the house, and to the town. He had roots here, his going way back to the 17th century. So he wanted to move his family here, and they were warned out of town. That was something they did quite often when you first moved. It was not friendly. When you first moved to a town, they warned you out of it just in case you became indigent. They didn't want the town to have to take care of you.
Oh my goodness!
Interesting.
Wow, that's an
I
interesting. I would
know.
not have known
I
that.
know.
Yeah.
Now, could you tell us a little bit about the fire and then the town purchasing Westfield and the home?
Sure. After Dr. John Hart, the Hartshorns bought the house, 1803. Colonel Hartshorne, well, he wasn't colonel at the time, James Hartshorne, bought the house to raise his family in. And he would live there all the way to his death in 1870. So a long time. And that's probably why we call the house the Hartshorne House. But his family continued to own it. His wife, his widow, lived there with his daughter and son-in-law until the 1890s. When they sold it to an ice company, and it was used as a tenement for ice house workers. So all of this history going on in this one little house. So, and then there was in 1929, the town started to be affirmative about trying to purchase more land at Lakeside. Forward thinking for the time, I think. They bought a lot of the Hill property. You've heard about the boathouse.
Yes.
Okay. The Hill family owned a little more property than that. They bought some of that. And they also bought the Porter Milton Ice House Company and all of the land associated with it. That's the Hartshorne House, Hartshorne Meadow, Westfield, and the Hall Park, all of that. They purchased for $15,000.
Deal.
Yeah, it was a good deal.
It's a really
And
good
they
deal.
bought it for parkland. And they bought it at the beginning of October. And then on October 29th, big fire.
Oh, that's the fire.
So they actually purchased it before the fire?
Before the fire.
Oh.
And the ice houses went up because the walls were all packed with cork, which is highly flammable. So it was a really huge, huge fire. It's a miracle that the little house remained intact.
I know, that is.
But actually, always, forever, we've been saying that the town purchased it after the fire. But actually, because of this show, I did some more research. See what you did?
Wow,
So now
something
we know.
new.
Now we
It's
know
an
the truth.
exclusive.
That's right.
I know,
it's
detective work
exclusive.
there.
Talk of the town.
Wow.
So when was the association officially formed that saved the house? Was that the...
Well, kind of coincidentally, in 1930, all the cities and towns were celebrating the tercentennial of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So all the cities and towns wanted to have some little project for it. And so the Tercentennial Committee, or Tenery Committee, I don't know, it's 300th Anniversary Committee of the Town of Wakefield, took this as their project. And the park commissioners actually did some renovations to the house to make it structural. I guess it was in bad shape. It was quite old after all. And so at that time, after the anniversary was almost over, I think when people were thinking, how can we preserve this? The committee started, the Hartshorne House Association Committee. It was really small and an ad hoc committee, but it started in 1930.
Now how does the town work with the committee to take care of the home?
Yeah, that's a great question. We got a lease, the property leased in 1931. Had to go to town meeting for that. And then the Hartshorne House Association was actually incorporated in 1936. So we've got a lot of anniversaries going on.
Wow, I would say so.
The town gave the massive sum of $100 in 1930.
That was a lot of money in 1930.
Plus the services of the DPW, I guess, to do the work, the initial work on the house. And then since then, the town has helped a little bit, but mostly the association has taken care of the preservation and the maintenance of the house. The exceptions were the roof, to have a historically appropriate roof put on. It was a kind of a desperate situation, $22,000 in the 1980s, which was a lot. It's still a lot.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So Alan, we know you're one of our coworkers with
Right.
Emmy and I. So tell us a little bit about the role of caretaker and how you got into it, and what were your qualifications did you need to be a caretaker?
Sure. So I'll give a little bit of history. So I've been at Wakefield High. This is my 11th year, and I came in right out of college as a student teacher, actually. And I just it was very fortuitous for me that as I was finishing my student teaching, another teacher was going out on maternity, and I was asked to interview, and I ended up getting a long-term sub position and ended up sticking around. They haven't been able to get rid of me yet.
We don't want to get rid of you.
I'll take it. I very much like being here. But anecdotally, that teacher was Jen Metropolis, and she and Rich Metropolis, they were the caretakers of the Hartshorne House at the time. And so just getting to know Jen and Rich a little bit as well, given that I was taking over for Jen when she was going out on maternity, just talking to them and learned about their living situation and what they were doing. And I feel like that was really when the seed was planted in my head. They invited me over at one point, and I saw the house, and I said, "This is beautiful. This is amazing." And then a few years ago, Rich had returned as our principal for a tenure here at Wakefield High, and he said to me, like, "Do you know, you remember like the Hartshorne House?" I said, "Oh, sure, of course." And he said, "Well, I'm still sort of in touch with the board, and they're going to be looking for some new caretakers. And I know you and your wife, Emily, are thinking about like where you're moving next. Like we had a lease that was running up." And so long story short, he encouraged me to apply, and it had always kind of been in the back of my head at what a cool spot it would be. And so Emily and I applied, and we interviewed, and lo and behold, here we are. And so that's how I knew about the house. In terms of the caretaker roles, it's a really cool gig. Like that's just the best way to describe it. I really enjoy it. I'm sort of an extroverted person by nature anyway, so I like chatting with people and hanging out and showing off the house. But it's really in the best way possible. There's just a lot to do with the house. There's sort of the everyday stuff that you do for any living situation, but ramped up to that next level because it's a public venue. So taking care of the yard, taking care of the lawn, taking care of the inside of the house, things that everyone does just by virtue of living somewhere, but knowing that it's public, and between rentals and events and board of director meetings, and just the nature of the house being like this beautiful piece of historic property, when you own a home or rent a place, you have that benefit sometimes of being like, I feel like a lazy Sunday. I'm just going to sit around, where you don't necessarily get that benefit when it's a public venue. So little added extra inspiration. But then beyond that, between like besides just routine house maintenance, it is a venue for rentals for all different sorts of functions. So that is a large slice of the time pie in terms of keeping up with the house. So anytime someone wants to rent it for any sort of event, they call the house or they email us or they email Nancy and she forwards it to me. And then I get back to them, or more truthfully, my wife. She mans the phones much better than I do, much more than I do. So we get in touch with them and we'll show the house. And then, any rental agreements go through us. And then on days of rentals, we're there to help oversee their event. And we do some light setup help with them. And I feel like I'm rambling at this point, but
So you're on the second floor? Is that how?
yeah. So the way
Okay.
I was just about to ask, is there a part that is for the caretaker so that it a little more modernized so that because I can't imagine the electricity was
right.
Are
all
there
that
showers?
great?
Do you have a bathroom?
Right.
Yeah,
So-
no, these are the questions we're going to ask.
Yeah, that's what everyone
so
wants
the,
to know.
the downstairs is maintained as sort of like a living museum. If you go in there, it's not quite 1681, but it does feel like a little bit of a
Yes.
time tunnel. You go in there and you definitely feel like you're not in 2020 anymore, which is like super cool. Like I love that. But the upstairs, which I've heard referred to by some as the caretaker quarters or the caretaker apartment, but the upstairs is where, like, for lack of a better expression, our stuff is. So I know when it first came out and my students knew that we were going to be living there, they asked, like, are you going to be able to grade our papers on Google? Like, are you, like, and I said, I don't have to churn butter. Like, I'll have a microwave, a TV. So yeah, that is where
I would
our
have paid
stuff
money
is.
to see that, though.
Right. It is still very much like a historic house. So it's like, I'm fortunate in being 5'9". In my family, I'm the only male who's not at least 6 foot. So when we were moving in, my brother and father had to do some ducking to help move stuff.
The doors were a little.
Yeah. And, floorboards of different sizes and whatnot. And to me, it's sort of this cool, like, sort of anachronistic, where, we have these amazing, like, different size floorboards, but I'm watching Netflix, so that is where we reside in the house. But it's really great in terms of the history of it. And I know I'm an English teacher, but, I dabble in history appreciation. And an anecdote that I tell often, but I think it helps people understand a little bit of what it's like to live there, was we moved in on a June 1st, and things are so busy at the end of the school year that I feel like I didn't really get to soak up what I was living in, but getting ready for the 4th of July, which is huge in Wakefield, right?
Yeah.
The parade goes
my
right
gosh.
through.
Oh, it goes right by.
Yeah. And
Yes.
I just had this moment where it really hit me. I was setting up some stuff for the 4th of July, hanging some banners and whatnot. And I was just thinking about 1681 being the verifiable date. And then it hit me that that's 95 years before the Declaration. And so, like, I just have to believe, and I know this isn't how it actually happened, but in my mind, somebody was hanging out there July 4th, 1776, and they got a knock on the door. They said, hey, what's going on? And they said, oh, like, they declared independence. Who? Oh, Jefferson, Sons of Liberties, all those cats, right? And just like, there's my joking anecdote of it. But yeah, there was already history pre-existing what we often, maybe we shouldn't, but we often think of like 1776 as the year the
As the
nation was
start,
founded.
yeah.
And
And
no,
it's right, no.
not the case.
They
So.
probably would have heard about it 2 weeks later.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yes, they definitely would have heard about it.
No email.
Right.
Yeah.
But now the Humes. Can you tell us a little bit about the Humes?
Sure, they were the first caretakers of the house, and they claimed. Well, I think Mrs. Grace Hume, was very much a grande dame. Okay, and it was a time when you were referred to as Mrs. Archibald Hume.
Yes.
I don't think anyone has ever called me Mrs. Joseph Bertrand. I would be like, huh?
Right.
But they had lived in Melrose, and she became the caretaker of the house, the hostess, in probably started living there in 1935. They weren't there for sure in 1934. They were there in 1936. I couldn't find a street list for 1935, but the number then was 0.
Oh.
0 Church Street.
Wow.
And on the street list, it says Colonel Hartshorne and Archibald Hume.
Oh, that's funny.
So she was a force, I think. She used it as a business. She ran a business there. She was the hostess, and she prepared meals, teas. You could, for a reasonable fee, if you had a party of 7, she would prepare a bean supper for you. And we have all these cute little cards that were produced over time. But while she was living there, she introduced a lot of different things. For example, in the 40s, she organized a group of high school students to create a victory garden in back of the Hartshorne House. And that same year, the garden club created the herb garden there for the first time. She was very close with the garden club. She was a member of it. The garden club also started in 1930. So another thing she did that people don't know as much is that she was probably the person who, more than anybody else, who created the floral way. She had the idea from Washington, D.C. of having a kind of a remembrance way for veterans who had been killed during World War II. And she had the idea, and she kind of partnered with Gardner Campbell, who was the editor of the Wakefield Item. And between the two of them, they formed a group of people to promote the idea. And so they kind of created that. So she was definitely a very, very strong woman. She had great ideas, but she continued to be in that house as the hostess until 1967.
Wow.
Oh my goodness. So had her husband passed on?
I'm not sure. I'm trying to find out when he passed on. I have not been able to find out her maiden name, which I find amazing. But yeah, she was 93.
Oh my God.
Imagine her on those steps.
Oh, I know.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's what I'm trying to think of.
Yeah.
That house is a little creaky.
Yeah, it's a little, she must have been creaky too.
Now, going back to the caretaker
Yeah, sure.
role, you said when there are events there that you help set up.
Yeah.
So how involved, like after you set up, do you just leave the house or do you guys have to stay there and also be part of the event?
Yeah, so we're there on site, and in terms of the setup, we try to have some really solid communication with the event in the days, ideally weeks and days leading up. And so they'll let us know how many tables and chairs they'd like provided for them. So I'll make sure to pull those and get them in the general area of where they'll want to have them. And then during the event, we are home, but we are not like hanging out. Like if you rent the Hartshorne event, you don't have to put up with me and like my annoying jokes or anything like that. We're usually just upstairs in our apartment watching Netflix, or truthfully, a lot of times I'm just grading papers. And if they need anything, then we can certainly be there for them. And then we'll usually pop down, like getting towards the end, just to remind them, you know, how much time they have left, and if they need anything that we can provide. At the end of the event, we will. Usually it comes down to just us having like spare trash bags for them. It's a, kind of a carry in, carry out situation because it is a rental venue, but it's not, it isn't Spinelli's, right?
Yeah.
So we do ask that all renters take their trash with them. And most rentals we've had have been just like really awesome. People are renting this place over all sorts of other options, usually because they have some appreciation for the historic nature of the house. And so, so we're there to help out, but we don't personally cater. I'm not like
a little chef hat hanging out there.
I'm not against that sort of work, but not for the Hartshorne House.
So when you applied, what type of qualifications is the committee looking for when they're looking for a new caretaker?
Well, it is actually a post that a lot of people are interested in having. For example, I was hearing from Mr. Drinkwater about a year and a half before before we had an actual vacancy.
Oh, wow.
But obviously we're looking for people who have a demonstrated commitment and to the community, who like people and enjoy history, who can take care of a historic house, who don't mind a little bit of manual labor. But more than anything else, I think it's liking people, because the role of the caretaker is so pivotal and so important to us, to be kind of an ambassador for us with all of these people who call about rentals. The rentals are an important income stream for the Hartshorne House Association, and every penny that comes into the house is spent on the house.
So a lot of the the former caretakers have been Wakefield High School teachers.
I know.
Some of them have.
So
we've been going
had
through a
four.
list.
I think we had 4 couples from the high school. So you don't have to be a Wakefield High teacher.
No.
I was gonna say, I feel like I was the first one in a while.
In a little
Oh,
while,
okay.
and it was funny because my son Ben had Mrs. Metropolis, and then she had Mr. Mr. Drinkwater.
That's funny.
But yeah, we have had quite a few Wakefield High School teachers, but it hasn't been predominantly.
Oh, okay.
It just has happened to work out that way.
Yep.
And of course, they're always wonderful people,
Yeah.
and they're a real credit to the Hartshorne House Association.
And what's the length of stay? Like, what is the average length of stay for these caretakers?
Well, Mrs. Hume, of course, was 37 years.
Yeah.
That'll throw off the average.
Yeah.
right?
Wow, that does throw off the average.
Yeah.
Maybe we should say
You can
median.
stay
What's the
as long
median?
Yeah, median.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Thanks,
so,
math teacher.
so
Yeah.
we sign a 1 year at a time
Oh, really?
agreement.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
So we're
Okay.
right now a little bit more than halfway through our second agreement.
Oh,
so
okay.
so yeah.
Okay, great.
What's your favorite event?
It's so funny. There's been a lot of events already since we've been here, and I'll say our bread and butter seems to be like showers, like bridal and baby showers. There's a lot of those, but we've also had birthday parties, graduation parties,
Beer?
company
Beer
events. Yeah. So we've done a beer tasting fundraiser, which was
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah.
But in terms of my favorite rental, last winter there was a rental. There was a woman, she called up and she had been like recently retired, and this was probably January when she was calling, and long story short, she just wanted to have like a winter get together for her friends. And I wasn't really sure what that meant, but when she came by to check out the site beforehand, I asked her, and she just said like, oh, I'm just really looking for an excuse to get a bunch of friends together. They're all, history fans, right? And so when she came and set up, it was somewhere in between like a winter wonderland, winter solstice themed party where she had these lights that she made out of ice. She made like ice orbs and put lights in
Oh my
them
goodness.
outside. And she had like old school, looked like 1940 styled ice skates that she displayed on a table. And she had made a little hot cocoa station. And she had like a little soup station too. And it's just like, to me, like the most like wholesome New England winter
Oh,
get together. So
That's really a great idea.
yeah.
How
And
many
so
people can you fit in the...
so inside, there's a difference between fit and fit comfortably. And so we always tell prospective renters just to be honest with themselves. And truthfully, I do think that is at least partially responsible for why we have an uptick in rentals during spring and summer as
Because you
opposed
can
to
be
the winter
outside.
because of the grounds, right? So, for example, for that beer tasting event that we've done twice now, the fundraiser, we had like 40 people, 40 to 50, something like that. And it's pretty tight in there. So that's sort of like shoulder to shoulder. We have the Christmas tea every December, and it was pretty tight because we don't cap it off and it kind of keeps flowing. But I would say if you're using the outside as well, up to 80 is really, but again, we do have some events where we have an ice cream Sunday
Yes.
Yeah.
fundraiser
Yes, I
in
do know,
August.
yeah.
And not everyone was there at the same time, but we had a rough head count of about 300, I think,
Oh my
for last
goodness.
August. Now,
Just
again,
rotating through
and
the
that's people coming and going. So it can get full, and to me, it really just depends on the nature of the event that you want to have.
And can I ask you, where do you get your ice cream?
So this, at least the 2 years that I've been part of it, it's Mellothar's.
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 It's
Okay.
always been Mellothar's.
Is that- yeah, okay, cool.
Interesting. And speaking of the outside, you're responsible for the gardens then, right?
So it is. I do a lot of the groundwork, but I do have to tip my cap. The Wakefield Garden Club, they represent. They are a huge help in terms of getting that Hartshorne yard looking as beautiful as it is. So I do a lot of like the day-to-day stuff, mowing and weeding and edging, but without the Wakefield Garden Club, we would not look as beautiful.
And the garden committee.
Oh, true.
The cool thing about the house is the Hartshorne House Association is that you have to serve on a variety of committees. So you can go into the committee of your kind of specialty. And the lady that heads the garden committee is really committed to it.
Now, how much land is with the home? Does it go down to Vets Field or Floral Way?
It goes down to this fence.
Yeah, right.
behind the house, but the beautiful gardens that you can see.
They're gorgeous.
Yeah, and so there is quite a bit of land for events. It's actually kind of perfect for around 75 to 80 people. A lot of times people will bring a tent. Just in case of the R word.
Right.
And can the public visit anytime, or do you have hours?
So we don't have hours per se. Anytime someone wants to see it, if they call and leave a message, more than willing, provided that we can just work out the scheduling. We want to show the house off, but it isn't just open. If you were to go and knock on the door, just try to open the door, it's locked. But
your safety.
Yeah.
And all the time it's open on when we have Wakefield Heritage Day. In September, the last Saturday in September.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there are, and like the ice cream social, like that is a time where we have times where things are open. But just like any, town building, you can't always get into every building you want,
Right.
Nor should you.
Yeah, right.
Nor should you. Okay, I'm going to ask an old house.
Right.
Haunted? Not haunted. I have to. Does it creak? Does it not creak?
Nancy, do you want to jump in first?
We've heard a lot of stories.
I don't think I've ever heard a story of the house.
I will say this. I have, that's a question I get still a lot and got a lot when I first moved in. And I'll just preface with, I am like the biggest horror fan in the world.
I know, that's why I'm
stories. I teach an elective at the high school. It's all about
Yes.
Gothic fiction.
Yeah.
I want to believe, as Fox Mulder on the X-Files says, nothing yet. I say yet. I'm open to it.
You're open.
I'm
Okay.
open to
Possibility.
it. I think part of it is I grew up in an old house. My wife grew up in an old house. We're used to wind making weird noises, but nothing that I can confirm yet. And again, I'm open to it.
Because I know you are because of everything you teach.
Right,
so.
right,
Yes.
but not yet. So I'm sorry. I feel like when I tell people this, there's a look of disappointment
I
in their
know.
eyes. So
We're disappointed.
I hate to be, the messenger of a
I
lack
want you to
of-
write the book about
right,
it.
right.
Come on.
If it happens, I promise you I will.
screenplay.
Right, that's it. So nothing yet, unfortunately.
And who can people contact if they want to volunteer to help out at events, or if they want to be part of your committee?
Well,
Or
we have
donate
the-
money.
Oh,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
We have a website, hartshornehouse.org, where all that kind of information is on it, as well as a link to our PayPal to join the Hartshorne House Association or to make a donation toward its upkeep. Or just to ask a question or get hooked up with Alan and Emily about events.
And are there any similar historical buildings in the area, like other than Hartshorne House in different towns?
There's a Parker Tavern in Reading.
Oh,
And there are several in various towns. Here in Wakefield, I think we're lucky. We have not only the Hartshorne House, but we have the West Ward School,
Right,
which is
right up the street.
right, the Wakefield History Museum, which dates to about 1847. And I've heard really kind of creepy things in there.
So that
Come back sometime.
Maybe that's-
maybe you have to
That
go
could
check
be where
that out.
they moved,
yeah.
They
There's
moved up to there.
a teacher who taught there for 60 years or something. She was the principal of the West Ward School for a while. So we have the museum as well as the Hartshorne House. And not many of the local towns around actually have a museum as well. We're always talking about maybe sometime kind of pooling our resources and having one day when the various towns will have all their old buildings open. But it's pretty hard to coordinate.
Well, Wakefield is very lucky to have
Oh,
the
very
Hartshorne
lucky.
House and both of you to be part of it. So I want to thank you again for coming on the show. We really appreciate your time.
Thank
Thank you.
And
Our
thank
pleasure.
you for watching Talk of the Town.